I had a chance to listen to some of the earlier conversation about insurance as a service. And today, everything is a service. When you think about 3 years ago to where we are right now, the pandemic actually accelerated a lot of the as a service adoption. Not particularly only because it had an opportunity, but because there was an actual need. There was a lockdown. You couldn't go anywhere. Things had to come to you. There was the adoption of convenience. There was a way of, it was necessary. Now, you fast forward 2 years, the question comes to mind, well, is that growth sustainable? Is that something that's going to stay forever? Are we going to see a cliff? Are we going to see something else? I think the answer is all of the above. It largely depends on consumer behaviors and what we tend to accept. This kid's definitely not me, or if he was, I was born that way and I grew up in Chennai, so the color difference is exactly visible. But leaving that aside, newspapers, 1990s, think about me as a little one. I'm exaggerating how little I was, but think about me, Sunday morning, the last one to fashionably wake up, and there's benefits to waking up late. Some of you probably know that if you're a second child. It means you're not fighting for a bathroom in a 2-bedroom apartment. You're not fighting for, you're not quabbling over things, particularly back in time, the newspaper. It was a precious thing. The first thing you wanted to do is get out, go read it. On a Sunday morning, I grew up in Chennai, so I remember Sunday magazine sections used to be color. That was the only color paper back then. And so that was one of the most interesting things to take and look at. Why am I going on about newspapers here? You're talking about subscriptions, probably ringing a bell. Dates back to a very old way of saying you paid a monthly fee in many ways, and it was delivered to your doorstep every morning. You can't deliver the exact same thing the next day. It is still a paper, but the content is different. It caters to the current day. It serves what you want to read in many ways. The advertisements could be new. The classifieds have changed. Why? Why did all of these things happen back then? Because the consumers needed newness. They needed things to be different. And when you think about that concept and this earliest example, and probably more alongside milk in some ways, maybe other things too. We got used to getting things new, something new to expect, anticipate, and something delivered on a consistent basis. And we know that it will just show up. And so that concept literally applied to everything that we know of today as a subscription economy or as a service economy, right? So these are examples of companies. I've heard a lot about the consumer side of the conversations earlier in your sessions. When you look at the companies that are fueling these things, they broadly fall into 2 buckets, right? One is traditional companies, the big mammoth companies that have existed for decades now, HP, Microsoft, all those you look in the left. Computer Associates, in some ways, Symantec is dead. They have to transition to the cloud. They had to transition to the cloud. Then there are companies that literally are digital natives. Now, some of you were probably born in the early 2000s, and you're a digital native, if you didn't know that, right? You're a Gen Z, which means you were born into an online economy where you started consuming things on a digital platform right from the beginning, and it was not a transition. For somebody like me, I was born in the 80s, early 80s, which means there was no internet, at least in India, when I was born, right? My access to internet came much later, but it was sooner than some of them that are leading these companies as CEOs as baby boomers. At the end of the day, when you think about those companies, they have to scale up. They have to continue to expand portfolios. Think AWS. When you think about something, they started as a mere bookstore. They started as a mere bookstore where a Barnes & Noble refused to invest in them. But the interesting thing is when they made the shift to an online library, they realized the advantage of serving consumers what they wanted to read when they wanted to read it without the physical. And one of the best things about that is most people carry books when they travel. How many books can you carry when you travel? And so that's where some of the online sort of stuff was born. One thing led to the other thing, led to the other thing. And when all of us were thinking about Amazon as this massive online delivery company, which they are today, little did we realize that they were actually building a mammoth data center behind, essentially take over the entire application market space and the managed infrastructure space. That was the data center initiative that Amazon was building behind, where they now have north of 175 applications that are served as a service for different parts of consumption. The most recent being, some of the most recent being customer support and customer service. Companies like Service Cloud are digital natives in some ways. Companies like Salesforce are digital natives in some ways. But Amazon, nobody quite realized that they're going to come in and offer customer support. And here's what's the most interesting thing about it, right? They learned from their consumers because they learned on the back of their own customer support on the e-commerce platform. If they can deliver customer support so well, they can monetize it as well. And one of the most recent things, this is close to my heart, is the virtual healthcare. Look up Amazon Care in the US. That's pretty cool. Everybody thought Amazon's going to go do insurance when they partnered with Hathaway and some of the other companies out there. But they quickly got out of that business and they now have virtual healthcare business. What's almost ridiculous but interesting about it is they have a physical presence through their Whole Food stores, Amazon Fresh stores, and Amazon To Go stores. They also can offer their platform on their own AWS data center, and it becomes a seamless omni-channel experience. So some of these things are pretty interesting when you think about where they originated in the digital world. Telecom. Today, we all are very good at consuming services from the likes of Airtel or services from the likes of, call it Netflix, right? Streaming companies, we were likely talking about this earlier. As consumers, we drove the adoption of some of these as a service models. We made this consumable even in the enterprise context. The symbol right in the middle there, Adobe. Adobe is a company that's in Bangalore, headquartered in San Jose. I lived for 12 years in San Jose, and I've been living in Bangalore for the last 5 years. And Adobe was my window view from my San Jose office for the longest time. And I remember when I used to work for the firm back then, we implemented SAP for Adobe. We implemented Salesforce for Adobe. But the interesting thing happened when Adobe said, we're going to shift everything to the cloud. You know that little Creative Cloud CDs we used to buy, Creative Cloud 4, Creative Cloud 5, anybody is deep into Photoshops and photography, you know that's the thing, Illustrator or Lightroom. These are things that were staple. I remember having 6 of Adobe's Creative Suite CDs. That all just went online overnight. They flipped the switch. And that was for an industry in the tech sector that was grappling with, how do I make the shift? Adobe led the way. Adobe said, we're going to cut out all the middlemen. We're going to flip the switch. We're going to go completely online. What that did to Adobe was something like this. That journey was not easy. That journey was pretty damn hard for a company like Adobe, and it by far is hard for any company that goes through this transition. Now, when you look at it from a technology angle, there are a lot of things that happen behind it, right? You're making investments in capabilities. Companies are making investments in new IT, a lot of infrastructure capabilities. There are big investments. What's happening prior to that is that chasm in the middle, right to the left of the dotted line, where the red and the black intersect. That's really where there is a pause, if you will. Companies in the traditional sense, they have the option of either adopting as a service models or keeping it status quo. What happens with status quo is the street, when I say the street, talking about Wall Street, and how they valued companies. When you go back to Adobe, and you should all Google Adobe at some point and see that, the case study, their stock price took that significant peak, when they flipped the model and they showed the Wall Street what they could do. At the same time, the black line, the revenue, went down. That first several quarters, the revenue kept going down. And that's counter to belief when you can have lower revenues, but you can have significant increases in stock market accretiveness, right? And so when you think about what's happening there, it's the street is trying to value a company based on its recurring revenues. The street's basically saying, I understand that you're going to have predictable revenues quarter after quarter after quarter, and I understand that means it's value for you. You are making your customer sticky, but revenue is going down, cost is going up, and as a result, you have that interim significant gap where that's panic moments. Companies go through pain. When there is a spread between the red and the black, that's a lot of pain. Many companies that are very short-term focused give up. That's a failing proposition. So what can go wrong in this transition, right? If you haven't thought through the business implications, if you don't have the elasticity and the story to tell your street, then you are going to have this significant burden on your back. But fast forward to the right side. Over time, that revenue stickiness far surpasses operating costs because your investments are more upfront, your capability build is more upfront. What's really sustained? There are some costs, don't get me wrong, there are some costs in sustained operations like sales, customer success. You cannot operate, a company cannot operate in its exact same way as it did in its traditional model. Enterprise software, when we bought enterprise software, Oracle is a great example. You're making $10 million, $15 million deals with Oracle over a 5-year TCV. With Salesforce, you're actually making more like a $1.5 million annual recurring revenue. Completely different metrics. The sales teams are compensated differently. How you serve the customers and make sure your customers actually use your product is different. And consequently, the business capabilities you need to support your revenue growth spike, that hockey stick after Q4, depends entirely on whether we're able to sustain the customer experience behind all of this. So what does taking that plunge means? Companies taking the plunge into the anything as a service model. There's a 10 years ago, right? Let's say 10 or 12 years ago, and the US obviously was driving a lot of this. Today, I was having this conversation. I literally landed, and if I yawn, guys, it's not because I'm bored, it's just because I haven't slept all of last night. I landed after my trip to Chicago at 3 a.m. So excuse me if I feel like I'm fading. But a week and a half ago, I had the privilege of listening to two very renowned individuals in our Partner MD conference. Simon Sinek, some of you may have seen his videos, read his books, Find Your Why. And another one was Joe Zitto, who is the chief investment strategist of Blackstone, happens to be a client of the firm. Now, one of the interesting things you hear him say is, it's not hard skills and soft skills. And that sort of stuck with me. And this is all Simon Sinek's words, not mine, right? It's hard skills and human skills. And what stuck with me is the fact that hard and soft are opposites. And we often expect both of them in an individual, while they wind up being opposites in context. So when you apply that to a company, companies don't necessarily, some companies think of transitioning to the cloud or transitioning to an as-a-service model as an IT challenge. In my analogous phrase here, the hard skills are the IT challenges. But then there's also a significant set of changes that company needs to make from a customer journey point of view, understanding financial implications, and the organizational culture. That's my equivalent of a soft or a human skill, right? It's business. It's not something where you configure, buy, stand up, look at availability or velocity or scalability from a core IT perspective, it's required. Don't get me wrong, it's a pretty big challenge and it's required. But what I'm referring to is none of that is going to make sense unless you got your customer journey right. So I'm sure you've heard a lot of them talk about, I heard groceries, I heard things like cars as a service, food, meal kits. I mean, today, when you look at India, we are almost leading everything as a service. You can get spices delivered to your doorstep on a subscription basis, on a weekly basis. You can get cycles. The latest thing I saw, and I was stunned that nobody thought about this before, is children's cycles. You can subscribe for cycles and they'll send you based on age, the right size of cycle. Once the child outgrows the cycle, you get the next size. And here I am, I wind up going and buying cycles for my 5 and 10-year-old every 2 years or so. Why did I think about this? Shaving kits have been around for a while. Stitch Fix in the US is equivalent of that in India for getting boxed clothing. But that all started with the customer journey. When you think about how these things started, there was a consumer expectation and experience-driven necessity. It wasn't based on, I need good technology to do this. No, it was technology is almost always an enabler to do something that would be consumed in a seamless way. We would be completely masking the realities if we are not able to understand the financial consequences of doing that. Customer acquisition costs are high in general, right? So retaining a customer, this is an age-old view. Retaining a customer is less expensive than acquiring a new customer. But what happens, let's go back to SaaS, right? On the left, I say SaaS, software as a service. That's the very first thing that ever started in the as a service model, when companies like Salesforce or others came in and say, you just go to your browser, log in, and voila, your entire software is out there. Couldn't quite fathom that. But imagine Oracle. Oracle had this mammoth software. It needed data centers and servers. It had all these infrastructure requirements on a company that was buying, whether it's SAP or Oracle, either one, they were the big giants. But then they have to shift when they had Fusion that came out a few years ago, when they have on cloud, other offerings. Now the next challenge is, how do I shift these existing customers to the new platform? That's the second business challenge. This is not an IT challenge. It's a business challenge, and it is a financial challenge. Why is it a financial challenge? Some of you that have purchased or been in a purchasing arrangement with large enterprise software companies, you know that software had a cost. 20% of that software was support revenue. That support revenue generated 98% margins for these vendors, Oracles and SAPs. And that was such a great revenue stream that they would never give that up. $5 million software, $1 million annual support revenue. Now, I have a customer who's just bought that software, and here I am, customer's done a 5-year TCV-based purchase, and year 3, I'm trying to change this customer from this traditional on-premises software to a cloud version of it. How do I do that? What do I tell the customer? What's the incentive for the customer? What is my impact? Because I'm going to lose that support revenue stream of $1 million year after year. And I've got a story associated with that, which I'll also tell you. But companies have to make a choice. We have to think of the revenue mix shift planning. And that's what it means. I take the $1 million revenue, I look at the opportunity costs associated with that. When I transition the $1 million into make it, right, $500,000 annual as a service fee, which usually includes a software, includes support. Software as a service did not break that up. It had both. So then as a customer, I need to have the right business case sold to me in order to make that transition. As a vendor, as a salesperson, as a financial person, as a C-suite exec, I need to know what are my constraints, what are the variables I'm operating with, what am I giving up, what am I gaining, how long is the pain, when will I make the shift from pain to gain, right? So that's a revenue mix shift analysis from a financial point of view. Obviously, the valuation goes up. Adobe is proof, many other companies, Salesforce is proof, the valuation always goes up because the street values recurring revenues. I said I'll tell you a story about this. Some of you who've lived in the US, been in the US, probably know Blockbuster. Blockbuster videos, DVD rentals. This is before Netflix's time. Blockbuster went from DVD rentals to, they had a CEO back then that went to the board and said, I do need to change. I think we need to change to streaming. It seems like the right thing to do. The board did not approve it. This was when Netflix was also serving DVDs on a subscription basis. They'll send you 2 DVDs or 3 DVDs at a time. You turn it after a certain amount of time, put it in the mail, right? USPS mail. That's when Netflix was actually testing the market for subscription services. Back of their mind, they knew they were going to eventually change technologies, but they had already started the subscription mentality. They did introduce a streaming concept, and that's when Blockbuster said they need to do that too. But the board said no. And the board said no because guess what? 12% of the revenues for Blockbuster came from late fees because customers did not return their DVDs on time. And the board did not want to lose that 12% late fees. They wound up losing 100% of the company. Blockbuster shut down years later. They just couldn't keep up with the streaming business. And so that's where you go back to the status quo that we saw in the dotted line in a few sections past. Blockbuster is an example of where they stayed status quo, whereas other companies made the investments, made the plunge, got to where they did. And finally, it's the organizational culture. When you think about commitment to making this transition, it's required. If leadership, the board, investors are not aligned to what they're all going to, that orchestrated journey is just going to be that much harder. I'll not hit all the other bullet points there, but we said everything starts with the customer journey, and I want to double click just on that, right? The connected user experience. This is how we sort of see this playing out in any use case. Let's have you focus on the top half of the screen for a couple of minutes here. Take anything we do today. If Netflix is your choice, so be it. If Amazon is your choice, so be it. If I'm going to make it a Gartner or IDC or any research report, or if you go to AWS and you want to go to the marketplace, what's the first thing you do? You discover. You're trying to find something. And when you're trying to find something, I'll get back to that. Let me go to the top half first. I'll come to the bottom, lead to cash capability. L2C stands for lead to cash. B2B is business to business, B2C is business to consumer. I'm sure many of you know that. So I'm trying to discover. In some cases, I try, right? Most of us go through evaluation processes. We do a trial. We then convert it to a full use when it gets purchased. Sometimes we just try and cancel, or it's called a try before you buy, or it's called a freemium. That's a whole separate story. Purchase, fulfill. What's fulfill here? In historical sense, in Oracle, if I take the IT lens, fulfillment means actually shipping something. It's called shipment. Even today, it's called shipment. That gets me that they didn't change that to fulfillment because shipment necessarily means I'm taking a physical item, putting it in mail, and sending it off. I don't think I do that with software. All I have to do is enable. That's called provisioning, in other words, right? That back half of the cycle is adoption, use, and renew. Now, why is that important? Once I've sent the product or made the product available to the customer or the consumer, I'm pretty much done there, right? They have to use it. The reality is the success of anything as a service depends on adoption and renewal. Adoption, use, and renewal. The more the customer is successful using the services, the more the customer is successful generating their own outcomes from your product or offering, the better the chances that the customer is going to stay with you. Now that word is key, stay. Because what as a service models also did, in addition to making it easy to buy, it also made it easy to leave. You don't have to keep it around forever. You can discontinue your services as you please. Whereas historically, I was so happy getting everything up front, recognizing the revenue for it, put a massive contract that says, you cannot exit from this, otherwise you'll pay your entire life's wealth as termination fees, right? There are some clauses here and there with as a service business models too. You'll have termination fee, you have minimum commitment, you have all kinds of things. But the reality is you can cancel and move on. And so that cycle on the back end, adopt, use, which is I'm going to broadly classify as customer success, and then renew, which will be the result of the customer success and the delight of the customer in using the product, is going to essentially enable you to say, I'm good. And guess what? This is not a once and done deal. This is a continuous journey. Why do companies like Microsoft, maybe even Thoughtworks, have customer success teams? Because you want the customer to achieve what they want to achieve. Otherwise, they're not coming back to you. I said I'll come back to the bottom, lead to cash capabilities. When I'm discovering, when I go in and download a white paper, for example, the firm I work for, you go download a white paper, there's a good chance that we've created a lead. We already know, based on the information you enter, who you are. We'll likely contact you from sales team. We'll ask you what's your purpose. That's a lead. That's a capability that a business, from a business point of view, I need to have. And there are systems like a marketing cloud in Salesforce or Marketo. These are all applications that are available that can capture the lead, help you move the lead, sales lead through stages. Becomes an opportunity if we qualify it. Evaluating and trying. The best example of evaluate and try is Amazon Prime. I almost hated that I use Amazon example because everybody uses Amazon as an example. Even say Netflix, right? Same thing. We use those as examples. There are so many other examples out there where you can evaluate and try. Essentially, all that means is you're choosing something that you want, that's configured. When I or you as a customer or consumer choose, I'm making choices behind the scenes from a system and a business facilitation point of view. That's configuring your product offerings or your services. There's a price associated with that. For example, we were talking about insurance early on. You buy just life, your price is X. You buy life and you buy health, your price for both put together is not X plus X, it's something less than 2X because there is a bundled discount in it because you're buying both together. Oh, by the way, since you bought life, are you interested in life insurance for your spouse? Are you interested for your kids? What about other intended benefits like a chronic disease, right? You will get paid a lump sum if you're ever diagnosed for a chronic disease. These are add-ons. These are things where we generally call it guided selling. In some ways, we generally call it predictive selling. If a customer picks this, then I'm going to suggest something. It's very simple in the back end. I'm sure all of you have developed e-commerce platforms that go in and say recommendation engines based on what I put in my shopping cart. These things are happening in a pricing and quoting engine behind. Purchasing, there's a whole contract lifecycle management, right? Essentially, it looks at what am I actually agreeing to buy from you? What am I actually agreeing to sell you as a vendor? And then there's order management, which is confirming it. I know this is what is going to trigger what's called revenue recognition. We didn't hit that topic, but there's a massive implication downstream from an accounting and revenue perspective, as well as tax perspective in as a service business models. It's not just the IT sense of it. When we go and shift companies and tell them or build an as a service model, how you account for the revenue is very different from how you account for the revenue in a traditional sense. If I sold you a service with a 3-year commitment and it's going to serve you for 3 years, and you paid me 1 year's worth of payment today, my start date is today, I cannot recognize that revenue all in just today or this month. It is spread across the next 1 year. That's revenue reporting in many ways. The government, the tax rules, the accounting rules, they require that you amortize your revenue over the period of service fulfillment. The last bit here is, how do I know that I can seamlessly bill for what you ordered? How do I know I can invoice? We just talked about revenue recognition. How do I know what you have? If you've bought 10 things from me, AWS, 175 apps, what all did you buy from me? If I am a consumer or I'm a customer service person behind the scenes in Amazon, when you come in, how do I know what all you have bought? That's an entitlement, some of which can have licenses to it. Depends on software, whatnot. So that's kind of the cycle that invariably follows whether you're a B2C customer, a B2C company, or a B2B company. That's the cycle that we generally follow. From finding what I want, to liking what I want, to staying with it. A little bit of a fun fact at the bottom here, right? I don't think that needs explanation, but if it's too small for you to read at the bottom there, that's a Gartner data source that essentially says pretty large chunk of companies are going to be software as a service, if not already. That's a huge number of companies by 2023. Will we get there? Time will tell, but I think everybody's going to have a flavor of software as a service. I'm going to leave you with a little bit of macro trends here. I may have skipped a slide here. Yeah, let me hit this and come back to that. Without going into every single box here, when you think about everything we spoke about from an IT perspective, which is your right side, everything we talked about from a business perspective, which is on the left side, this is an organizing principle for some of us to think about how, why, and what, and when do I need to be doing what I need to be doing just to be successful in this transformation. My core of my work historically and more recently has lied in helping businesses transform their operating model from where they are to where they need to be for success. Many companies fail. That's just the plain and simple truth. But a lot of companies are incredibly successful in doing that. And I'm particularly impressed and proud about the number of Indian companies that are now influencing the global adoption of SaaS. Like Freshworks is a great example. They play in spaces that Salesforce cannot. It applies to a lot of different businesses, different sizes. But they started with a certain vision. The vision that basically said, the middle red box on the left, who is that customer? Who is the buyer? And what is the best way to own that customer? As a result, what is my platform strategy, product strategy? What is my handshake between platform and enterprise architecture? All of those questions that come to mind. So I promised, this word is almost abused, that it is insane not to talk about it, right? Unicorn trends, the number of unicorns that pretty much, there's a birth of a unicorn every minute, if not more these days. This is from a PwC article. The source is at the bottom. If you choose to, you can Google unicorns 5 trends. The author is Vicky Huff, and my mentor for many, many years, vice chairman of our West region and global new ventures leader. I was in fact participating in a fun Jeopardy 2 weeks ago that talked about metaverses, digital natives, and valuations, where this economy is going. It's pretty darn interesting. When you look at these 5 trends, they're largely consumer driven, but they have massive implications to enterprises. First one is financial services. That's, I think, a no-brainer. That was one of those industries that remained undisrupted for a very long time. I mean, I'm not going to politicize this, but like it or not, the demonetization drove it. The whole adoption of digital payments in India literally had one of those pandemic-driven like moments with a hockey stick in India, a QR code in every corner of the street. But it didn't stop there, right? That's the interesting part. I'm sure Paytm's got a lot to figure out with what they're trying to do and where they want to play, but I think the US is still a little behind in the financial services play compared to India, because India is trying to do a lot of things. And I think the whole UPI interface is one of the smartest things that we ever did. You go to Paytm, you can integrate to paying your utilities bills. You can pay all of your FASTag tolls. You can pay banking, insurance. You can buy services. You can buy things. Everything is sort of integrated, and that's the idea of platformization. They're giving you one-stop shop for doing everything that you need to pay for. Seems like a no-brainer, but I think there's more to come. The more companies try to do this, the more it's going to be interesting to see how banks and traditional financial institutions become actual storefronts, e-commerce players, and whatnot, right? Electric vehicles. I think we're behind electric vehicles as a country. I think that's policy driven. That's infrastructure driven. That'll hopefully change, but we are also adopting EVs quite a step forward. Tata Nexon was and is still offered as a subscription vehicle. I don't know if anybody knows that. Roughly 25,000 rupees a month or so. I thought it was pretty cool that Tata did that. I don't know the split between how much is sold on subscription versus how much is bought outright, but it's pretty cool that companies like Tata, Jaguar, Land Rover have launched the subscription car business, whereas in the US and in the Europe, that's been there for a little while. It's different from leases. If somebody had that question, it is different from leases, right? That's a financial arrangement. This is different. And I'm happy to take that question if we need to as well. Gen Z, right? Some of you here are Gen Zs. I don't know which gen I belong to, but I recently saw an article that said in Tamil Nadu, a couple just got wedded in the metaverse. That blew my mind away. Like, how the hell does that happen? All the guests had their own avatars and they showed up in whatever clothes they wanted to, and they could just go to different people, different sections. And 1 month later, here we are. We as a firm onboarded my 1,000 interns this year on our own metaverse. I took somebody drinking in the metaverse in the bar. Not nearly as fun as drinking live, but hey, if I can't have a bar, might as well. I definitely prefer a real glass though. Mobility companies, right? Mobility companies, they made a huge pivot. When you think about 2 years ago, and Uber failed in India, miserably failed. I think there were other reasons behind it, but really it is, Ola also became a platform. Uber was not fast enough to become a platform, but Ola became a platform way sooner than Uber did. They regionalized it. They started doing things around food and delivery and whatnot. Uber tried it, but I think they just were on the verge of giving up anyway. But many countries, that's what's happening. Mobility companies are no longer, we thought, and by the way, this is the first time I've traveled in 2 years. And for the first time in the US, Everybody knows flagging down a taxi is so easy in a big city. It no longer is that easy. Taxis are now a commodity that is near extinct in the US, thanks to Uber and Lyft in the US and others elsewhere. I thought that was pretty cool. And lastly, health and wellness. This is close because my client right now is a telehealth company in the US. And it still sort of amazes me that we would consume healthcare sitting exactly the way I am sitting and speaking with you all right now. Some of us probably, it makes it feel less comfortable for me, but maybe some of you who are used to just meeting in the metaverse or consuming everything sitting in front of a computer, maybe using your time more usefully doing other things, would think, I have a cold, let me dial my doctor and find out. Doctor's going to prescribe you something, look at you, whatnot, right? Maybe there are devices now that you can have that can plug it and it can upload the vitals to the doctor as well. And there are, by the way. But the interesting thing is regulatory constraints. And we didn't hit that as much as I would have wanted to, but I know that's very different depending on who I'm speaking with. The regulatory constraints and financial services or healthcare are very country specific. And we had to break those barriers. Cryptocurrency was one of those things that's yet to break the barriers on regulatory implications, thereby the large swings in how they behave. But let's wrap it up and think about this. There are mega trends. There are mega trends that will shape the sheer birth of new companies and new consumption models. There are actual necessities, like the pandemic demonstrated to us, that will not just birth new companies, but will fuel significant growth, which it already has. And there are going to be competitive pressures from what was otherwise never a competitor. Think Amazon for healthcare. Think what happened with Uber for the taxi and mobility system. Potentially, what's going to happen to universities and physical institutions once metaverses become more academic oriented. There are going to be disruptions that we least think are going to come that will drive adoption of as a service businesses. And lastly, it all boils down to how we as consumers have changing needs, how we get more receptive to doing things differently. We all think we are resistant to change. Frankly, many times we are. But it's also one of the most important things that drives change. And we do change. We don't know it. We change based on our circumstances. And we, as a circumstance of change, expect that services provided to us also change. Demonetization, QR code. Case in point example. So, this was lovely speaking with you. I know I have done all the talking. I would love to take questions and give you some time back if that is the case. But this was excellent talking to all of you.
Hey, Hari, thanks. That was a brilliant session. There are a few questions, though, that have come up. I can just run them past you and you can go over these. The very first one that we have is, why, according to you, are enterprises moving towards everything as a service business model? Is it to unlock business growth?
That's definitely one of the reasons, right? We go back to our fundamentals of why. It's because it's an expectation. When you think about Big Basket in India and traditional grocery stores and Big Basket daily, right? These things are evolutions, not revolutions, the way I would say. These are evolutions not because of only revenue growth. Revenue growth is required and it invariably, I would think of it as an outcome. But consumers want it. If consumers don't want something, your revenue is not going to grow at the end of the day, no matter what you do. Companies are moving to as a service models because A, it is expected that consumers are able to consume things the way they want it to consume at their pace and as quickly. And B, it's because it's easy. Luxury goods are also a great example of this. Not everybody can go and buy that Louis Vuitton, right? Or Bottega Veneta, name it, whatever you call it. But what if I offered you a service that pays X thousand rupees a month, adds up to no more than a height sign bag in 6 months, but you're able to change your handbag every month? It makes it easy, it makes it less expensive. But for my company who's doing this as a service, imagine the number of customers who I can serve that way. And if I can unlock value based on subscriber base, of course, I need to get my capital investments and depreciations and whatnot, right? That's where the financial implications come in. But that's the reason why companies want it. I can reduce costs in the long term based on my scale while I sustain a subscription plan. Gyms are a great example. How many of us have gym memberships and never show up? Right? Subscriptions are there for a reason. Magazines, it'll show up on the doorstep, it'll stay there for 1 week. That's why vendors like to go subscription.
Fair enough. Hey, we've got another one. Hari, it's what does a XaaS ready organization for best customer and employee outcomes look like?
What does a XaaS ready organization for customer and employee outcomes look like? Did I get the question right?
Yep, that's right.
So let's talk about for customers. A XaaS ready organization for customers, it starts with change management and communications. Making sure you're reading in your customers on what you're trying to do and understanding early on what business cases and business outcomes drive your customers' business. It is very, very important that a company doesn't transition its products to as a service without knowing if their customers are going to be successful using their products. I'll give you an example, right? If your primary customer is the Department of Labor in the US or Department of Defense in the US, it's pretty stupid to transition to as a service models, which is multi-tenanted in a cloud infrastructure, right? They're probably the last ones to feel secure about it. So you need to know what business your customers are in and whether it's going to help them achieve their outcomes when they move to as a service business models. The second thing for customer success is that I feel valued as a customer throughout my lifetime with you. We measure this as CLTV, or customer lifetime value, or CLV, different acronyms. The customer lifetime value is, for me as a vendor, how much of that customer's dollar can I extract from that customer? From a customer's perspective, what is it that I'm getting throughout my relationship with you as a vendor that makes me feel more valued, that gives me the value of using your software? And that's why companies like Salesforce and Microsoft have customer success teams. Questionable, but customer success teams that are helping these customers use the products. Use it, you're paid for it. Let me help you figure out how to use it. Let me help you unlock that, right? That's from a customer point of view. Now you asked about the employee point of view. From an employee point of view, it's innovation in some ways. The product team is very different minded. And some of you in Thoughtworks, you're a custom software development company, and you really know this way better than I do. Agile developments and releases that are more often and whatnot, right? Everything is on an ongoing basis. It's not a cliff. And so as an employee, I feel that I can innovate more frequently, that I prioritize customers' requirements and outcomes rather than looking at it as, oh, once a quarter, let me look at what are the next features I need to be thinking about that I will release 12 months from now. It's not how you're operating. you're more engaged as an employee. This is a product team, right? As a product manager or a product owner, if you will, you're looking at where to unlock differentiation. The way you're looking at development is very different from features and benefits to unlocking differentiation in the market and driving more value through the product. From an employee perspective, if you look at front office, salespeople, their behaviors are very different. They are now compensated on a completely different metric called annual recurring revenue. And by the way, the cost of purchase for a customer is lower, which is operating expense, compared to me selling a $5 million or a $10 million software. I'm selling you a $100,000 software. It's easy. Let me show it to you. By the way, you'll get this every day. It could be different every month. You'll have it in your release. It's not like you're stuck with this version for the next 5 years, right? The business case enumeration changes a little bit from a sales point of view. And from an employee perspective, it's also the value that the overall company has. It can't be made light of to say that when your share price goes up, your productivity is going to go up. That's just real stuff, right? You're working for a company that's innovative. You're working for a company that's staying relevant in the market. You're working for a company that's being heavily valued in the market, Wall Street. And so consequentially, you're working for a high value vendor. So there could be many more reasons and things will change, but those were the top of mind.
Cool. I think we have one last question. I think it's extension of your Blockbuster example as to when do companies actually pivot and leave the regular stream of income and pivot to newer business models.
Yeah. Companies pivot in one of three occurrences. One is there's a significant market shift, right? You've got vendors out there, and the industry in general is making this shift. Now, remember, I'm answering a question about pivot, right? Which implies that the company was in a traditional state before. You're going to pivot because there is an industry shift, fundamental. Or you're lucky enough that you're in a company that is innovative enough that you are the industry shift maker, right? Number two is when the economy is actually not in a high spend mode. Funny enough that sometimes the OpEx related buying has fatigue involved in it. Long-term costs can be high for a company that's buying it, unless they know how to do it. But imagine a recessionary situation. I need to minimize my capital expenditures. I don't have that kind of spend capacity. I shift to small expenses. Companies have to be ready to sell smaller dollar value and give options to their customers on how they consume it. So economic requirements. And three is the product is just literally suited for something like that, right? You make the pivot. This is where the choice between being a native company versus a transitionary company comes in. Too often, and I've also been part of the crime unit that helped companies move their software from a traditional model to a new model, while in some cases, you should have just created a brand new product that wasn't meant to be transitioned, like cloud native. So that's the other area, that the product was meant to be served as a service, and it does have the stickiness in doing that.
Cool. Hari, we've got just one last one that's popped in just now. It's from Yamini, and it's a question that says, wouldn't subscription in disguise support recycle, repair, renew by model?
Would subscription in disguise support recycle, renew?
And repair?
It could. It depends on the offering, of course. If you're talking about a business where, I'll give you an example of my kids' book. There's a company called IQ that we use for subscribing to children's books. And every 2 weeks, a bag of 5 books get delivered to my house. Now that's a great example of an answer to the question Yamini just asked. I don't need to go buy new books and kill trees all the time. Somebody's book read is somebody's new book, right? So that's a great example of recycle, reuse, upcycle, whatever you may call it. But books, DVDs, out of fashion. Even kids' toys in many ways. Toys run out, right? In the US, I know there are consignment stores that will buy products, toys from you at rock bottom prices. Something I had paid $20 for would be bought for $2 and sold for $5. That's okay. It's perfectly all right because somebody's old toys are somebody else's new toys. And so I 100% support the idea of it is in disguise a recycle, upcycle, reuse, renew. Not everything, however.